Most of the decisions we make in our lives don't feel important at the time. For example, choosing a school, a university, accepting a particular job, getting married, entering religious life, deciding where to live, or even choosing your own closest friends. None of these decisions come with a sign telling us that this will shape the rest of your life. We only realize their importance when we look back years later. And that is why prudence is such an underrated virtue. People sometimes mistake it for hesitation or excessive caution, but genuine prudence is something very different. It is the ability to recognize what matters most and then to commit yourself to it without constantly looking over your shoulder. In other words, prudence is not about keeping every option constantly open. It is about choosing the right option and having the very courage to let the other things go. And that is exactly what today's readings this Sunday are about. When God appears to Solomon in a dream and invites him to ask for whatever he desires, we are witnessing one of the most revealing moments in the Bible. Imagine that same question being asked of you tonight. What would your answer be? Better health? Financial stability? Successful career? Longer life? Solomon could have asked for any of those things. And instead, he asks for a listening heart, a heart capable of recognizing good and evil and governing God's people wisely. Why does that request please God so much? Because Solomon understands something that many of us spent years learning. The quality of our lives depends less on the number of opportunities we receive than on the wisdom with which we choose between them. Wealth without wisdom can destroy us. Success without wisdom can make us very proud. Even power, if it is not guided by wisdom, easily becomes destructive. And by asking for wisdom first, Solomon allows everything else to find its proper place. The Church gives us a beautiful example of that this very week as we will celebrate St Ignatius of Loyola. And if you've ever heard of the spiritual exercises, you probably know that they are really a school of discernment. St. Ignatius was convinced that the deepest question in life is not simply what do I want, but what leads me closer to Christ. Those are two very different questions, and the answer often changes everything. And St. Paul takes that same idea even further. In his famous words, God works all things together for the good of those who love him. These words are sometimes misunderstood. Paul is not saying that every event is good. Illness is not good. Failure is not good. Sin is never good. What he is saying is much more hopeful. Nothing is beyond God's ability to redeem. And if we place our lives in his hands, even painful chapters can become part of a greater story that we cannot yet see. Looking back, many of us can recognize moments that once felt like disasters, but eventually became a turning point in our lives. A disappointment redirected our lives. A failure taught us humility. A closed door forced us to discover another path, even greater one. And God rarely wastes anything when it is entrusted to him. And all of this prepares us for Jesus' parable in today's gospel. So a man discovers a treasure hidden in a field. A merchant finds a pearl of extraordinary value. Neither hesitates, neither pauses to calculate whoever the sacrifice is worthwhile. They sell everything, not reluctantly but joyfully, because they know exactly what they have found. And that detail is important. Jesus never presents the kingdom of God as a burden. He presents it as a discovery. Christ is not asking us to live smaller lives. He is inviting us to exchange lesser treasures for the greatest treasure of all. The difficulty, of course, is that we are surrounded by things that appear valuable: success, reputation, possessions, comfort, recognition. None of these is evil. They simply make poor goods. They promise more than they can actually deliver, because they were never meant to occupy the center of our lives. And perhaps the greatest competitor to God is not money or pleasure, but our own ego. The quiet habit of making ourselves the measure of every decision. The merchant in today's gospel teaches us the other way. He lets go, not because he enjoys losing things, but because he has found something infinitely better. If the longer form of today's gospel is proclaimed in your church, Jesus finishes with the parable of the dragnet. It is a sober reminder that belonging to the church is not the same as belonging to the kingdom. Faith cannot remain a family tradition only, or a cultural identity. It must shape our decisions, our relationships, our priorities, ultimately the kind of people we are trying to become. And perhaps that is the question with which today's gospel leaves us for the coming week. If someone examined the way I spent my own life, my energy, my attention, what would they conclude my greatest treasure is? Because our real priorities are rarely revealed by our words, they are truly revealed for others by our choices. Solomon chose wisdom. St Ignatius chose the greater glory of God. The merchant chose the pearl beyond price. And every one of them discovered the very same truth. Once you have found the greatest treasure, everything else finally falls into the right place.